The evening sun dipped low over the small suburban neighborhood of Portland, Oregon, casting long shadows across the narrow street where the Parker house sat. It was a modest single-story home, paint peeling from its wooden siding, blinds drawn tightly as if to keep the world from peeking in. Behind those walls lived 8-year-old Emily Parker, a child whose life had become a prison of silence and pain. Emily sat curled up on the faded brown couch in the living room, clutching her stomach. Tears rolled down her cheeks, soaking the sleeve of her oversized t-shirt. She had been crying quietly for almost an hour, her small body shivering as the dull ache in her belly twisted into sharper pangs. "Stop making those noises, Emily," a deep, irritated voice called from the kitchen. It was Mark Parker, her stepfather. He stood with a can of beer in one hand, scrolling lazily through his phone with the other. His dark hair was messy, his shirt wrinkled, and the faint smell of alcohol lingered around him. Emily didn't respond. She had learned that talking back, even to explain herself, only made things worse. "I said quiet," Mark snapped, banging the can down on the counter. The sound made Emily flinch. She pulled her knees closer to her chest, burying her face in her arms. The pain in her stomach was unbearable. But worse than that was the loneliness. No one to comfort her. No one to tell her it would be okay. Her real father had left before she was born. Her mother, Linda, had been everything to her. Gentle hands, warm hugs, bedtime stories. But Linda had passed away 3 years ago, leaving Emily in the care of Mark. Since then, her world had grown darker with each passing day. The lonely hours. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, its hands moving slower than Emily thought possible. She remembered her mother's laughter echoing in this very room, remembered her soft voice singing lullabies. Now all she heard was the crack of beer cans, the muttering of her stepfather, and the sound of her own sobs. Her stomach pains had started months ago. Sometimes they were sharp, other times dull, but always they came without warning. Emily had told Mark more than once, but he brushed her off every time. "You're fine," he would say. "It's just growing pains. Quit being dramatic." But Emily knew something was wrong. Deep down she feared it, and she feared that no one would ever help her. A world outside the window. The evening light filtered through a crack in the blinds, landing on Emily's pale face. She slowly lifted her head and peered outside. Children were riding bikes down the street, laughing, their voices high and free. A group of girls skipped rope on the sidewalk, their mothers sitting nearby in folding chairs, chatting as the breeze carried the smell of barbecue. Watched them with longing. She wanted to be outside, wanted to feel the sun on her skin, wanted someone to ask if she was okay. But her stepfather never let her play with the neighborhood kids. "Too much trouble," he always said. So she sat, trapped behind the blinds, her little world growing smaller with each day. The Millionaire's Drive. At that very hour, a sleek black Mercedes rolled slowly down the street. Behind the wheel sat Richard Hayes, a man in his mid-40s, sharply dressed even in casual attire. Richard was a successful businessman, known in Portland for his investments in real estate and community projects. But behind his success lay a personal ache. He and his late wife had never been able to have children. Richard often took evening drives to clear his mind, and tonight, his route had led him down the quiet street where the Parker house stood. As he passed, something caught his eye, a small shadow moving behind the blinds of one window, the faintest outline of a child's face streaked with tears. Richard slowed his car. Something in his chest tightened. He knew that look: loneliness, pain, fear. He had seen it before while volunteering at children's hospitals and shelters. He considered stopping but hesitated. It wasn't his business, he reminded himself. And yet, something urged him not to look away. Inside the house, Emily's sobs had quieted to soft whimpers. Her stomach felt like a knot that wouldn't untangle, and she pressed her palm against it, wishing it would stop. Her stepfather walked past her without a glance, grabbed his keys and muttered, "Don't touch anything while I'm gone." The door slammed shut and Emily was alone. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand and tiptoed toward the window. Pushing the blinds apart just enough, she peered outside. That's when she noticed the black car idling a few houses down. The man inside looked kind, his face lit faintly by the dashboard lights. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass. Emily froze. She didn't know why, but she felt safer just looking at him. She wanted to wave, wanted to call out, but fear of her stepfather's return kept her still. Richard, meanwhile, felt the connection just as strongly. He gave a small, reassuring smile before the light turned green and another car honked behind him. Reluctantly, he drove on. But the image of that crying child stayed etched in his mind. Nightfall. Hours passed. Emily's stomach pains worsened, but she forced herself to stay quiet. She climbed into her small bed in the corner of her room, the sheets thin and worn. Hugging her stuffed rabbit, her only friend left from her mother, she whispered, "I miss you, Mommy." Tears soaked her pillow until sleep finally claimed down. Richard Hayes lay in his luxury apartment, unable to shake the memory of the little girl's face. Something wasn't right. He had seen wealth and poverty, happiness and despair, but the look in that child's eyes was something else, something deeper. He made a quiet vow to himself. If he passed that street again, he would not ignore it. Foreshadow of change. In the days to come, Emily's pain would grow worse, her cries harder to ignore, and fate, guided by the silent prayers of a lonely little girl, was about to bring Richard Hayes back to her doorstep. For the first time in years, hope was quietly stirring in the darkness. Morning, the air in Portland carried the crisp freshness of early spring. Sunlight filtered through the blinds of Emily's small bedroom, painting lines of gold across her tear-stained face. She woke with a dull ache in her stomach, the pain lingering like a heavy weight. Her stepfather's heavy footsteps moved through the house, and she instinctively stayed quiet, as she always did. "Get up!" Mark barked from the kitchen. "I want the floor swept before I get back." Emily slowly sat up, clutching her stomach. She wanted to say she didn't feel well, but she had tried that before. The last time, Mark had yelled at her until she cried herself into silence. Now she just nodded faintly, though he couldn't see. Morning struggles. She shuffled into the kitchen, her thin socks sliding on the worn linoleum floor. Mark was already dressed to leave, his baseball cap pulled low, car keys jingling in his hand. He glanced at her briefly, his face twisted with impatience. "You better not laze around today," he muttered. "I don't want to hear any more of your whining." Emily pressed her lips together and nodded. She didn't argue. She never did. The door slammed behind him, and once again, silence wrapped around the house like a heavy blanket. Emily held her stomach, bent over slightly as the pain grew sharper. She wanted to curl up on the couch again, but she remembered his command. So she picked up the old broom from the corner and began sweeping slowly, her little hands trembling around the wooden handle. Every sweep of the broom made her body ache more. After a few minutes, she leaned against the wall, her forehead damp with sweat. Outside, children were heading off to school with backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. Emily longed to be among them. She used to go to school before her health got worse and before Mark started keeping her home more often, claiming he didn't have time for the school's nonsense. Now the world beyond the Parker house felt like a dream she could never reach. A familiar car. That same morning, not far away, Richard Hayes sat at a cafe near his office. The bitter aroma of fresh coffee rose from his cup, but his mind wasn't on the morning rush of business calls or the stack of documents waiting on his desk. Instead, his thoughts returned to the little girl he had seen the night before. Her pale face, the tears glistening on her cheeks, the silent cry for help in her eyes. He had barely slept, the image replaying endlessly in his mind. Finally, he made a decision. He closed his laptop, stood, and left the cafe. Instead of heading to work, he got into his car and steered toward the quiet suburban street where he had seen her. When his Mercedes turned onto the block, the Parker house came into view. His eyes scanned the windows, searching, and then he saw her. The sheer curtains of the front room. Emily's small figure appeared, broom in hand, moving slowly as if every step was a struggle. Even from the street, Richard could see the fatigue etched on her young face. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. Something was terribly wrong. The first meeting. Richard pulled the car over to the side of the road and stepped out. His polished shoes crunched softly against the pavement as he walked up the cracked path, leading to the Parkers' front porch. He knocked gently, no answer. He waited, then knocked again. Inside, Emily froze. Her heart leapt into her throat. Someone was at the door. She wasn't allowed to open it. Mark had made that very clear. But curiosity tugged at her, and fear battled with the faint spark of hope. She tiptoed to the door and pressed her small face against the gap in the curtain. When she saw him, tall, neatly dressed, with kind eyes that seemed gentle rather than harsh, something in her heart stirred. "Hello?" Richard called softly. "Is someone home?" Emily hesitated, then whispered, "I'm not allowed." Richard crouched slightly so his eyes were level with hers through the window. "It's okay," he said, his voice warm. "My name is Richard. I thought maybe you could use some help." Her lips trembled. No one had ever spoken to her that way since her mother passed. But before she could answer, the sound of an engine rumbled down the street. The stepfather returns. Mark's old pickup truck pulled into the driveway, brakes squealing slightly. Emily's eyes widened in panic. She darted back from the window like a frightened rabbit, clutching her stomach as though she could make herself invisible. Richard straightened, watching as the man climbed out of the truck. Mark's eyes narrowed when he spotted the stranger near his front door. "Can I help you?" Mark asked, his tone sharp, defensive. Richard turned calmly. "Good morning. I was just passing by yesterday and noticed your daughter didn't seem well. I wanted to check if everything was all right." Mark's jaw tightened. "She's fine. Doesn't need strangers nosing around." Richard studied him carefully. The defensive edge, the dismissiveness, the harshness in his voice. It told him more than words ever could. Still, he kept his tone polite. "I understand. I didn't mean to intrude. I care about kids, that's all. I volunteer at a few hospitals in the city. Sometimes I notice when something seems off." Mark gave a short, cold laugh. "She's just a kid. They whine, they cry. It's normal. Thanks for your concern, but we're good here." Richard's eyes flicked to the window where he had seen Emily moments before. Now the curtain was drawn tightly shut. He nodded slowly. "All right. Well, if you ever need anything, I live nearby." He reached into his wallet, pulled out a sleek business card and offered it. Mark snatched it without looking, shoving it into his pocket as if it meant nothing. "Have a good day," gave a small, polite smile. But as he walked back to his car, his heart burned with unease. Emily's whisper. Inside the house, Emily sat pressed against the wall, her small heart pounding. She had heard the exchange, every word. The man, Richard, had spoken gently. Differently, he didn't sound like Mark. He didn't sound like someone who would yell at her for crying. And when he said he cared about kids, she wanted so badly to believe him. She peeked through the blinds just in time to see him driving away, his car disappearing at the end of the street. For the first time in years, she felt something strange. Not relief, not fear, something else. Something her little heart had nearly forgotten. Hope. Richard's resolve. Driving away, Richard's thoughts churned. He had seen too many cases in his life where children suffered quietly behind closed doors, and he couldn't shake the look in that little girl's eyes. "She's not fine," he murmured to himself. "Not at all." He gripped the steering wheel tighter, making a silent promise. He wouldn't let this go. Richard Hayes had the resources, the influence, and the heart to make a difference. And whether Mark Parker liked it or not, he would find out the truth. The next chapter of Emily's life was already beginning to unfold, though she didn't yet know that her silent prayers had been heard. The following days moved slowly, heavy with silence inside the Parker house. Emily's stomach pain returned in waves, leaving her curled up on the floor or the couch for hours at a time. She tried not to cry loudly, but sometimes the pain broke through in muffled sobs she couldn't hold back. Mark barely noticed. His days were spent at odd jobs or out with friends, and his nights were often lost in front of the television, with cans of beer scattered on the table. If Emily tried to complain, his response was always the same. "You'll live," he muttered. Or worse, "Quit faking it. You just want attention." Attention. Emily almost laughed when she heard that word. Attention was the last thing she expected anymore. Richard can't let go. Across town, Richard Hayes sat in his office at Hayes Real Estate. His desk was piled with contracts and proposals, his phone buzzing with reminders, but none of it held his focus. Instead, his mind returned again and again to the little girl in that small house. He tried to tell himself he was overreacting. Maybe she was just shy. Maybe her stepfather really was just impatient, not cruel. But the look in her eyes, that haunted, desperate look, wouldn't leave him. Finally, one afternoon, he pushed aside the stack of papers, grabbed his jacket, and walked out. His assistant called after him about a scheduled meeting, but Richard just waved it off. Some things were more important than business. Back on the street, when he pulled onto the familiar street again, his chest tightened. There was the Parker house, dull and lifeless compared to the colorful yards around it. The blinds were closed, but through a small gap, he caught sight of her again, Emily. She was sitting on the floor, hugging her knees to her chest, her head bent low. Even from a distance, he could see she was pale, her movements sluggish. Richard parked his car and sat for a moment, debating. He couldn't just walk up and demand answers. That would make things worse. But he also couldn't keep driving by. Instead, he drove a block away and got out, choosing to walk past casually as if he were just a neighbor on an afternoon stroll. When he neared the Parker house, he slowed. That's when fate intervened. The front door creaked open, and Emily stepped out onto the porch, holding a small trash bag. She struggled to lift it, her tiny arms trembling. She bent slightly, clutching her stomach as if even that small effort was too much. Richard's heart clenched. He couldn't stand by any longer, he said gently. Emily's head jerked up, her wide eyes meeting his. For a second, she froze like a frightened deer. It's okay, Richard assured quickly, crouching slightly so he wouldn't tower over her. I'm Richard. We saw each other the other day. Remember? Emily hesitated, then gave the faintest nod. He offered a small smile. That looks heavy. Do you want some help? Her lips parted as if she wanted to say yes, but then fear flickered across her face. I'm not supposed to talk to people, she whispered. Richard lowered his voice. I understand. But are you okay? Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head quickly, as if terrified of admitting the truth. Still, the small gesture, so subtle, so full of unspoken pain, was enough for Richard. Before he could say more, a voice bellowed from inside. Emily, what's taking so long? She flinched, dropping the bag with a soft thud. Her eyes darted to the door in panic. Richard's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone calm. It's all right. I'll go. He gave her a soft nod before stepping back onto the sidewalk. The door swung open and Mark appeared, scowling. You again? He growled. Richard straightened. Just out for a walk, he said smoothly. Your daughter dropped the bag. Thought I'd give her a hand. Mark's glare deepened, but he forced a rough laugh. Yeah, she's clumsy. Always slowing me down. He snatched the bag and tossed it into the trash bin with unnecessary force. Richard's eyes flicked briefly to Emily, who stood small and silent by the door. Her eyes begged for help, though she didn't dare speak. Take care, Richard said evenly, though his chest burned with anger as he walked away. The search for truth. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He sat in his study, the glow of his laptop illuminating his troubled face. He had money, influence, and connections, resources most people didn't, and he knew how to use them. Typing quickly, he began searching public records for Mark Parker, Portland. It didn't take long. Mark had a history, multiple jobs, none lasting long, several complaints for neglect when he was younger, and Richard's heart sank. A record of domestic disturbance calls years ago, before Linda's death. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His instincts had been right. Something was very, very wrong in that house. The visit to the school. The next day, Richard made a discreet visit to the local elementary school. His foundation had donated to the district before, and the staff knew him. After a polite conversation, he gently asked about Emily Parker. The secretary frowned, pulling up the record. She hasn't been attending regularly, she said. Her mother passed a few years ago. Since then, her stepfather's been the guardian. He claims she's been sick. Sick? Richard asked quickly. The secretary sighed. That's what he says. But we haven't seen any medical notes and we've tried to follow up. Difficult to reach. Richard's jaw tightened. Has anyone checked on her? We've reported concerns before, the woman admitted carefully. But cases take time. And unless there's clear evidence, her voice trailed off. Richard left the school with his mind made up. Evidence or not, he was not going to stand by while an innocent child suffered. Emily's confession. 2 days later, Richard tried again. This time he timed his visit for when Mark was at work. He had learned his schedule by discreetly watching the house. When Emily came out to fetch the mail, he approached slowly, making sure not to frighten her. Hi, Emily, he said softly. She clutched the envelopes to her chest but didn't run. I promise I won't get you in trouble, Richard continued. I need to know. Are you sick? Her lips trembled. Tears welled in her eyes. Finally, she whispered, My stomach hurts. All the time. Richard's heart ached. Have you seen a doctor? She shook her head quickly. He won't take me. Richard knelt, his eyes level with hers. Emily, I believe you. And I'm going to help you. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Her small hands clutched the envelopes tighter, as if holding on to the only things keeping her grounded. A single tear slipped down her cheek, and for the first time, she whispered something she had never dared to say to anyone since her mother's death. "Please, don't leave me." Richard felt his throat tighten. He placed a gentle hand over his chest. "I won't, I promise." The turning point. As Richard walked back to his car, his mind was already racing. Emily was sick, neglected, and afraid. Mark Parker wasn't just careless, he was cruel. The truth had been revealed, and now there was no turning back. Richard Hayes was about to step fully into Emily's life, whether Mark Parker wanted it or not. For Emily, the years of silent suffering were nearing their end. And for Richard, a new chapter of purpose had just begun. The week felt like an eternity for Richard Hayes. Every night, he lay awake replaying Emily's whispered words. "Please, don't leave me." They echoed in his heart, louder than the ticking of the clock in his penthouse or the city traffic below. He couldn't ignore them. He wouldn't. Richard had spent his life building businesses, solving problems with logic and strategy. But this wasn't a deal to negotiate or a contract to sign. This was a child's life. Building a case. Richard began working quietly but strategically. He contacted a lawyer he trusted, David Walsh, a man with a reputation for fighting hard in family courts. David listened carefully as Richard explained what he had seen and what Emily had confessed. He leaned back in his chair, frowning. "It's going to be tricky," David said. "Neglect cases are hard to prove unless we have medical documentation or witnesses. But if she's sick and hasn't been taken to a doctor, that's serious." Richard's eyes hardened. "She told me herself her stomach hurts all the time. He refuses to take her to a doctor. That's enough for me. What do I need to do?" David nodded slowly. "We'll need to involve Child Protective Services. And you'll have to be careful. If her stepfather senses what's happening, he might make it harder." "I don't care how hard it gets," Richard said firmly. "I'm not letting that little girl suffer another day." The breaking point. That same evening, Emily sat alone in her small bedroom, curled up on the thin mattress. Her stomach pain had worsened, sharp enough to make her gasp quietly with each wave. She hugged her stuffed rabbit, the fur worn thin, whispering, "Please make it stop." Mark's voice carried down the hall, angry at the TV, angry at the world. Empty beer cans rolled on the floor. Emily felt trapped by pain, trapped by fear, trapped by silence. But then came a knock at the front door. Mark grumbled, stumbling to answer it. Emily listened nervously. When the door opened, Richard's calm but firm voice filled the house. "Good evening, Mark, we need to talk." Emily's heart skipped. Richard had come back. The confrontation. Mark narrowed his eyes, gripping the doorframe. "You again? What did I tell you?" "Stay away from my house." Richard's gaze didn't waver. "I know Emily is sick, and I know you've done nothing about it." Mark let out a harsh laugh. "She's fine. Kids whine. That's all." "No," Richard said sharply, his voice carrying a weight that made even Mark pause. "She's not fine, and pretending otherwise won't change the truth." For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the tension heavy. Then Mark sneered. "She's my responsibility, not yours. You don't get to tell me how to raise her." Richard stepped closer, his tone low but firm. "Being a guardian isn't about control. It's about care. And you've failed her." Face flushed with anger, but before he could reply, another voice joined the confrontation. David Walsh, who had followed Richard to the house. He held a clipboard of documents and a stern expression. "Mr. Parker," David said, "I'm an attorney. As of this evening, Child Protective Services has been notified. If Emily is not seen by a medical professional immediately, you'll be facing charges of neglect." Mark's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in rage. "You think you can just—" David cut him off. "Try to fight it and you'll lose her permanently." Richard's gaze softened as he looked past Mark into the hallway. "Emily," he called gently, "it's okay. You can come out." Emily steps forward. Emily peeked around the corner, clutching her rabbit. Her eyes were wide, her body trembling. But when she saw Richard standing there, her fear eased slightly. "Come here," Richard encouraged, extending his hand. She hesitated, glancing nervously at Mark. But Mark's silence, his stunned expression, told her what she needed to know. For the first time in years, she took a step forward, not toward fear, but toward hope. She walked slowly across the hall, her tiny hand slipping into Richard's. Richard squeezed gently, crouching so his eyes met hers. "You're safe now, Emily, I promise." Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "You came back." Richard smiled softly. "I told you I wouldn't leave you." The hospital? Within an hour, Emily was sitting in the back seat of Richard's car. Her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest. David followed behind in his own vehicle, making sure everything was legally sound. At the hospital, doctors examined Emily carefully. Richard sat by her side the entire time, holding her hand as machines beeped and nurses moved around her. "She's severely undernourished," the pediatrician explained later, his tone serious. "And these stomach pains, she's been living with untreated gastritis for months, possibly longer. With proper care, she'll recover, but neglect like this could have caused lasting damage." Richard felt a surge of both relief and anger. Relief that Emily would recover, and anger that she had suffered so long without help. Emily, lying in the hospital bed, looked up at him weakly. "Am I going to be okay?" Richard stroked her hair gently. "Yes, sweetheart. You're going to be more than okay. You're going to be safe and healthy and happy. I promise." For the first time in years, Emily allowed herself to believe those words. The first night of peace. That night, Emily slept peacefully in a hospital bed, her stomach soothed by medicine, her dreams unbroken by fear. Richard sat nearby in a chair, refusing to leave her side. As he watched her sleep, something stirred in his heart. He had built skyscrapers, led companies, made fortunes, but nothing had ever felt as meaningful as holding this child's trust in his hands. He leaned forward, whispering softly to her as she slept. "Alone anymore, Emily, not ever again. Mark's defeat." Meanwhile, Mark sat in his empty house, rage boiling. But deep down, even he knew it was over. The authorities had been called, and Richard Hayes was no ordinary man. He had the power to make sure justice was served. For the first time, Mark realized he had lost control. And with that realization came a bitter truth. Emily was never really his to begin with. A glimpse of hope. The next morning, Emily awoke to the soft light of dawn streaming through the hospital blinds. For the first time in years, her stomach didn't hurt. She turned her head to see Richard asleep in the chair beside her, his hand still holding hers. A small smile tugged at her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice almost too soft to hear. Richard stirred and opened his eyes, giving her a tired but warm smile. "Good morning, Emily." And in that moment, something shifted. For Emily, the world no longer felt like a prison. For Richard, life finally had the meaning he had been searching for. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be courts, paperwork, and challenges. But for the first time, both of them believed in something they hadn't dared to before. That followed felt like a blur for Emily. Days in the hospital passed slowly at first, filled with doctors, nurses, and medication. But unlike the lonely nights at home with Mark, she was never truly alone anymore. Richard came every morning, sat with her through meals, held her hand during tests, and read her stories at night until she fell asleep. For Emily, it felt like stepping out of darkness into light. For Richard, it felt like discovering the purpose he had been searching for all his life. The legal battle. Behind the scenes, Richard and his attorney, David Walsh, worked tirelessly. Child Protective Services investigated, interviewing neighbors, teachers, and even hospital staff. The truth came out quickly. Neighbors admitted they often heard Emily crying. The school confirmed her long absences. The doctors provided medical records proving her condition had been ignored. Mark tried to fight back, insisting Emily exaggerated, that she was weak and too dramatic. But his words only dug the hole deeper. His neglect was undeniable, and his lack of remorse sealed the case. Within a month, a family court hearing was scheduled. The day in court. The courthouse was a tall gray building in downtown Portland, intimidating in its size and silence. Emily clutched Richard's hand tightly as they entered. She wore a simple dress Richard had bought her, pale blue with a ribbon around the waist. Her hair was neatly brushed, and for the first time in years, she looked like the child she was meant to be. Mark sat across the courtroom scowling, his arms crossed. He looked smaller somehow, weaker without the walls of his house to shield him. The judge, a stern woman with kind eyes, listened carefully to both sides. She heard from teachers, doctors, and social workers. She looked at photographs and read reports. And finally, she asked Emily to speak. Emily's small voice trembled at first, but when Richard squeezed her hand, courage found its way to her heart. "My stomach hurt for a long time," she said softly. I told him, but he never took me to the doctor. He told me to be quiet. I was always scared, but she glanced at Richard, her eyes filling with tears. Mr. Hayes listened. He helped me. He didn't leave me. The courtroom was silent. The judge leaned forward. And Emily, how do you feel now? Emily gave the faintest smile. Safe. That single word carried more weight than any legal argument could. The verdict. When the gavel struck, the words seemed to echo forever. Full guardianship is hereby granted to Richard Hayes. Emily blinked, hardly believing what she had heard. Richard leaned down, whispering, It's official. You're coming home with me. Tears welled in her eyes, and she wrapped her arms tightly around his neck. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking with relief. Mark shouted in protest, but the bailiff guided him out. His anger faded into the background. The future no longer belonged to him. His new life had just begun. A new home. Richard's home in Portland was unlike anything Emily had ever seen. It was spacious but warm, filled with books, soft couches, and sunlight streaming through tall windows. The first night, Richard showed her the room he had prepared. The walls were painted soft lavender, shelves lined with books and toys, and a fluffy bed covered with a quilt. Emily stood frozen at the doorway, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. This is for me? Richard knelt beside her. All yours. You deserve it, Emily, every bit of it. She walked slowly inside, running her hand over the quilt, the toys, the books. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't from pain or fear. For the first time in her life, Emily felt what it meant to belong. The days of healing. Life began to change quickly. Emily's health improved under medical care. The stomach pains faded, her appetite returned. And her laughter, something Richard had never heard before, began to fill the house. She enrolled back in school, where she made friends quickly. Her teachers praised her intelligence and kindness. She loved reading, painting, and helping Richard in the kitchen. Richard, too, changed. His once lonely evenings now overflowed with stories, drawings, and the sound of Emily's footsteps running down the hallway. He had built his life around wealth and success, but Emily reminded him of something greater: love. A special moment. One evening, months later, Richard came home to find Emily sitting in the garden, carefully planting roses. She looked up with a bright smile. Hi, Daddy, she called. Richard froze, the word echoing in his chest like music. He walked over, kneeling beside her. What did you just call me? Emily giggled, her cheeks pink. Daddy, that's what you are now. If that's okay. Richard felt tears sting his eyes. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. It's more than okay. It's the greatest gift you could ever give me. Full circle. That night, as Emily drifted to sleep in her warm bed, Richard stood in the doorway watching. The soft glow of the nightlight painted her face in gentle shadows. She no longer looked like the pale, frightened child he had first seen behind the blinds of a broken home. She looked safe, healthy, and loved. Richard whispered to himself, You'll never cry alone again, Emily. Not as long as I live. And in her dreams, Emily finally felt what every child deserves to feel: peace. Epilogue. Years later, Emily would look back on that chapter of her life not with sorrow, but with gratitude. She would remember the pain, the fear, and the loneliness, but most of all, she would remember the man who stopped his car one evening, saw her tears, and refused to look away. Hayes had saved her life. But in truth, Emily had saved his, too, reminding him that the greatest fortune a man can ever earn is not wealth, but love. And so the story of a little girl crying from stomach pain in a lonely house ended with laughter in a garden, the word Daddy spoken with joy, and the promise of a future full of hope.